Good evening and welcome. I'm Jim McAdams. I'm the director of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. It's great to see all of you here tonight. I only recently learned tonight that because the acoustics are so good for the film that you actually need to speak into the microphone to equalize everything. Welcome to the inaugural event of the Nanovic Forum. The Nanovic Forum is the brainchild of the Institute's two founders, Robert and Elizabeth Nanovic, and their idea was to bring some of the most distinguished European thinkers to Notre Dame. Here I'm thinking of writers, historians, politicians, athletes, musicians, and others, and to give these people the opportunity to engage students and faculty on whatever they want, to let them have fun, to talk about things that are the most interesting and compelling to them. These forums might include a myriad of different types and forms, such as film showings, public lectures, meetings with students, or readings from their latest books. And tonight we have a great pleasure because our guest over the next 2.5 days is going to do all of that in different forums. Bernhard Schlink is an extraordinary individual who has the unique ability to think and to act in multiple fields and to address the big questions that concern humanity. Professor Schlink is a professor of public law and legal philosophy, as well as a former dean at the law school at Humboldt University in Berlin. He has written widely on constitutional jurisprudence and on questions of proportionality and justice. For nearly 2 decades, he was a constitutional judge in Bonn and Münster. At the same time, however, as you all know and are here to see, Dr. Schlink is a fabulously successful writer, novelist, and essayist who's written on themes involving collective and individual guilt, dealing with the past, forgiveness, and law and morality. And of course, one of his films, Der Vorleser, or The Reader, is the subject of our film tonight. By way of advertisement, before we get to the film and our speaker, I want to say, first of all, that tomorrow at 5 o'clock, Professor Schlink will deliver a public lecture at the law school on the topic of proportionality in constitutional law, why everywhere but here being the United States, yes? And this event will take place in the Patrick McCartan courtroom of the law school. So that's the first event. On Friday, he will offer a reading from his latest novel, The Weekend, which is about a weekend gathering of old friends, one of whom happens to be a former terrorist who's just gotten out of prison. This reading will take place at noon in the Hamas Student Lounge of Coleman Morris. I should also say I've been reminded that Professor Schlink's books are on sale somewhere out there, for after the film. So for tonight's event, we're privileged that Professor Schlink has agreed to join us and also to talk a bit about the film beforehand and then to stay afterward to entertain any questions that we might have. Professor Schlink.
Thank you for this nice welcome. Good evening. Let me cut the introduction short. I suppose some of you have not read the book, and you just sit back and relax and watch the movie. Some of you may have read the book, and once one has read a book and then watches the movie, one tends to expect to find the images that one has developed over reading. An author also may be tempted to expect to see the images that he has developed over reading, and I think that's why some authors are really unfair to the films that are made from their movies. I remember when the film The Reader was presented in Berlin, and Stephen Daldry and we all sat there, and the interviewers, the journalists, asked us questions, and one asked me, Milan Kundera didn't like the film that was made out of his book, Unbearable Lightness of Being. How can you like the movie that has been made out of your book? I suppose that Milan Kundera expected the images that he had developed over writing his book to find in the movie, and of course he didn't find them. A movie is a variation on the same theme and should be watched as such and enjoyed as such and can be enjoyed as such. There is a CD I like a lot by a pianist named Zacharias, a German pianist, who, as an encore, always plays one little piece by Scarlatti. The CD is all these encores, 50 of them, the same piece, but you listen to them, and one after the other is a new surprise if you take it as such, and if you don't expect to find the authentic Scarlatti. So the film is a variation on my book, and I think it's a beautiful variation of my book. And so you who have read the book, you too just sit back and relax and enjoy the movie. It's a variation on the book that you have already read. Thank you for your attention.
Questions?
You want to just call on people and say?
Yes, please.
Professor Schlink, vielen Dank, dass Sie heute Abend hier sind. Thank you for being here with us tonight. This is very moving. You spoke earlier about surprises, variations of a theme. May I ask you, once you saw the final version, the final cut of this for the first time, what was perhaps a surprise for you? Was war überraschend für Sie? What was perhaps unexpected once you saw your theme in a different variation, as it were, on screen?
Well, of course, it has changed. I mean, the book is really Michael Berg's book. He's the first-person narrator, so it's his. The movie is much more her movie. And one reason is that it's not a first-person narration from his perspective anymore. Another reason is that Michael Berg is represented by two actors that in a way weakens him, while she's represented by Kate Winslet. So that makes her stronger. So this was a shift that struck me when I saw it the first time. And well, once you have to translate a first-person narration into a movie, you have to add scenes and have to add dialogue. And I think David Hale did this masterfully. And this scene at the end when they meet in the prison, I like what he made them say. It is not quite what I had them say to each other. And I think the way he closed the whole thing by making him beginning to tell his daughter was a kind of similar closing as what I tried to do with my first-person narration in a completely different way. So yeah, there were surprises when I watched the movie, and I liked them. Yeah.
For me, it was a surprise following the movie in English. And I wonder what your experience with that is. Was it made in English? Because the books are all in English, and I presume the Odyssey was read in Greek or in German.
Okay, when it was read in Neustadt, of course it was read in German, but the film was made in English. And then for the German version it was dubbed. And I think the German actors dubbed themselves, and the English actors and actresses were dubbed by Germans. And when I sold the movie rights in 1998 or so, I thought about selling them to a German producer, but a German producer then would have just a German movie for a German audience. And I didn't want that. I wanted it to be an international movie. And that meant, I mean, English is the lingua franca, so that meant it would have to be an English movie.
I'm asking this because I was born in Germany myself and then brought up in England. And I found the freedom that the English language gave me to live, for a good many years without speaking any German extraordinarily helpful, because it was a sort of liberation from that past. And that's why I asked the question. Because the meaning of the movie, the meaning of the story does change when it's told in English, I think.
Yes, to some degree. But I still find much of the meaning of my book in the movie.
It's just a different movie. It's not a lesser, it's not a lesser meaning.
Yes, please.
The story itself of Hannah Schmidt and Michael, did you base it on a particular person, or this is all, obviously it's based on historical fact, but the individuals themselves, where did you get the idea?
Oh, I didn't model Hannah Schmidt after one specific person, nor Michael Berg. Of course, into each and every person I write about, or one writes about, people kind of find their way into, people I knew, I met, fantasized from those that I knew and met. I myself come into my books. So, yes, all kinds of people in bits and pieces are in the persons of my books and also of this book. But it's not modeled after one woman or one young woman.
I didn't think so. I just thought that the way you wove it all together was remarkable.
Yeah.
What's the significance of having Hannah so profoundly ashamed that she can't admit to her illiteracy? I guess I have a hard time wrapping my mind around why she can't admit to this. Why is the shame so profound?
It's interesting, David Hare, when he was working on the script, had the same question. And then he told me he had talked to quite a number of illiterate people in Great Britain, where he comes from. And they all told him, I would rather go to prison for a couple of years than to confess that I'm illiterate. In our world, being illiterate is one of the ultimate things to be ashamed of.
Is there any explanation for why she was raised illiterate or any background that we should have known for why she was illiterate?
That we should have known.
Like, oh, okay.
Well,
the book.
people are illiterate. So she is, she comes from what was Romania, or still is, what it was Hungary, and then it became Romania after the First World War, and many Germans who lived in Romania or Hungary or Yugoslavia were well off and well educated. Others were seasonal workers in, particularly in Prussia and Brandenburg, on these huge farms. And so they had a life here and there, and their kids often didn't, or sometimes didn't manage to get a normal education. And so some of them were illiterate. Yeah.
This is a counterfactual. Suppose Michael Berg had come forward and had revealed the mitigating facts that Hannah could not read, had not been the author of the document. Would you like, you, as a judge, a former judge, and as the writer, would you like to reflect that under those circumstances, now that the truth is out, what was the nature, how would you talk about the nature of Hannah's guilt?
Or she would still have been convicted and punished, probably like the others.
Yes.
Or maybe all of them would have been gotten a somewhat higher sentence, because there wouldn't have been one person in charge and the others just helpers, but all of them were kind of in charge, but maybe not fully and really. So they all might have gotten 8 years, 9 years, something like that. Yeah.
So on your understanding, so when, what do you think that contributes more to Hannah Schwitz when she admits that she wrote the document? Like, is it more of that she doesn't want to admit that she's illiterate, or is it more because that she's in such a huge remorse? It doesn't even matter like whether it's the intensity of the evil that she did, but it's rather that she actually did like the evil thing. The intensity doesn't matter. It's just that she's in such a huge remorse that she wanted to, I don't know, the way of like making up for it. Like,
No, she just didn't want to
okay.
admit that she was illiterate.
So that's more of
Yeah.
a reason from your point of view.
I mean, as she says in the end, up to the trial, she never thought about what she had done. And after the trial, well, as she says, she thinks it doesn't matter what she feels, what she thinks.
But then she still like committed suicide at the end. Like she never wanted to like hack herself. She just so.
Why she committed suicide?
Like, but like at the end she still committed suicide. Like she could have like had a new life even at that age. But then she didn't. She chose not to have a new life. She committed suicide instead. Like just 1 week away from freedom.
So you wonder why?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I haven't told half of the story in my book, and then on request I can deliver the other half. I have written what I had to write. I can only guess. And I don't think that she was burdened with her guilt to the point that she only could commit suicide. Maybe it's not elaborated on in the movie as it is in the book. She went to prison and she accepted this as a kind of withdrawing from the world as people go into a monastery. And then in prison she withdrew even more from the prison community in the later years and became also not communicating with the others anymore. Maybe she didn't have the strength to turn this direction of her life away from everything around completely and just go back into this world and live in this little apartment with the IKEA furniture and work for a tailor and join some cultural programs. Maybe it was just not the direction that her life had.
I had the sense of a certain discontinuity, and maybe you can, let me first say I enjoyed the movie immensely. I had a certain feeling of discontinuity with respect to her love of stories. The big story that comes back again and again is Odyssey. And her seeming, unless I missed something, lack of interest in her own story. When he asked you, what did you learn? What did you think about? She says, doesn't make any difference. Did you mean that to be that she doesn't want to talk about it? Or how does one account for her concern for stories unless one thinks of those stories as just, I don't know, soap operas on the television that distract you? That seems not to have been the case.
Well, two things. With illiterates, you find it often that they don't have a real relation to their own past. And in the book there's a moment when Michael Burke asks her, what did you then and where do you come from? And her answers are like, she is looking into a huge box and doesn't really know what to pull out and what answers to give. And that is something that has been observed often with illiterate people. They don't have a real relationship with their own past. Maybe because they can't put it into stories, following stories that they have read. I don't know. And also, you see, the whole generation, I mean, my parent generation, didn't talk about the past. And I think once you don't talk about your past for decades and decades, there isn't such a big treasure of the past that you decide to hide. But it probably, there isn't much anymore. What you hide from yourself for such a long time doesn't exist for yourself anymore. And so she is also, in a way, a typical person from that generation. Yeah.
For me, one of the narratives that is being invoked here is the Scheherazade narrative. And in that narrative, this idea that storytelling is what keeps us alive. Whereas here, telling stories does not keep the little girls alive in the camp. When Hannah finally learns to read, and this is the great triumph of her life, it does not keep her alive either. In fact, she is kicking books, kicking stories out of the way to hang herself. And then at the end of the movie, when Michael goes to New York City, we're given the line, all that literature can really give you is catharsis. Nothing comes out of the camps. So in other words, don't go to literature to look for meaning. and yet we have this story, your story, that comes to us in the form of literature. And so I'm wondering, how do we square this idea of the inadequacy of literature with the sort of need to tell this story?
That's a good question. I don't know whether I have a good answer for it. I think in a way, literature is the last institution that survives. I mean, if you look at a totalitarian regime like the Third Reich or Stalinist Russia or the early GDR, all the institutions that we kind of live with and that strengthen us and support us, universities, churches, unions, parties, they all have disappeared. But for many people then literature in a way becomes a kind of institution. And at the same time we know that literature doesn't make people better people. And education doesn't make people better people. I mean, among the Einsatzkommandos in the Second World War, the percentage of academics was unproportionately high. So education doesn't make us better people. But still, I think literature is the last institution. And we can read these stories, people are imprisoned and then they have nobody to talk to, they have nothing to do, and they start retelling them the literature that they have once read, the plays they have once seen. So it is nourishing without being reliable, and a reliable means of becoming a better person.
In the book and the movie, you sort of present different opinions on the trial both through Michael and through the other law students. And I was curious what your own opinion is on the role that these trials played in terms of Germany dealing with its past, whether you think they were good or bad, a means of escape or a means of moving on.
Oh, I think they were necessary. And at the same time, it was completely unsatisfying, as one student says. So, even in the Auschwitz trial, the famous Auschwitz trial, those who have been brought to court and have been convicted were the very lower echelons. And those who gave the orders higher up and thought it all out and planned it, they most often weren't caught and weren't brought to court and weren't convicted. So, yeah, I think what we had was necessary, but still it was unsatisfying. Yeah.
I have read the book and I have seen a movie, and the very title of the book and the movie, The Reader, draw my attention to the very process of reading, why we read and how do we read, and most importantly, how we read beyond the story, between the lines, and how we read other people, because some of them are closed books, as Michael was. So it's just my remark, and thank you very much.
I was interested in your comment that academics were unusually represented among the leaders of the Einsatzgruppe. It leads me to wonder what your perspective might be on any lesson. Michael asks Hannah what she learned, and we're disappointed there is no answer. I'm curious whether you think that the German people have learned something or should have learned something from this experience that they didn't. That it's sort of implied by your what I take from what you've written. And I guess one more way of framing that question would be whether intellect is inadequate. Because, I mean, the Germans were the most thorough modern philosophers there were. There are jokes about their thoroughness, Durchlichkeit. This was a nation that distributed Nietzsche to its soldiers on the front line in World War I. Do you think there was a lesson there? Do you think there was a lesson not learned there? And is there a lesson for us there?
I think it remains profoundly disturbing and troubling how fast a society with its institutions that thought it was so solid, even though the Weimar Republic was a different time, but with its institutions, with its parliamentary system, with its culture, with its heritage, with its tradition, it felt so solid, and it could break down practically within a few months. And that is something that I still struggle with, or we still struggle with. And how thick is the ice really on which we now live? I wonder this sometimes looking at Germany, I sometimes wonder looking at other countries too. We feel so safe, we feel on thick ice, and what happened in 1933 taught us how fast it can break. That's not a good lesson. Maybe that's just something to think about. Lessons. Yes, I mean, my whole generation, the so-called 68 generation, for a long time thought we had learned the right lesson. So be direct and open in your moral criticism of what's wrong, and teach your kids moral courage, and teach them resistance against everything that's wrong. And yes, I understand that that's what we try to do, and at the same time, once learning resistance becomes accepted mainstream, then is it still learning resistance? If you learn just swim with the mainstream, who has developed this idea that, and resistance didn't cost, I mean, it cost us a little bit around late 60s and early 70s. Now still it's part of our culture, even though it doesn't cost anyone anything anymore. I'm saying this only to explain why, the more I think about it, I think it's awfully difficult to learn from history, to learn from the past. Yes, I think Germany and the Germans really tried to do it, and they really tried to master the past and to not keep any secrets about the past. Whether the next generation is better, if it will be a similar, or won't be similar, a situation of crisis, I don't know.
Somebody used the word shame when describing Hannah, and I just never thought that was the right word when I'm reading. I interpreted it more as pride, and I don't think Michael made that decision to prevent her from the shame, but more that she knew that she was such a proud woman. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Well, I think, in a way, you can say pride and shame are two sides of the same coin. if you are proud even though you can't read and write, then to have this unveiled is a reason for, a profound reason for shame. And that Michael didn't talk to her or didn't talk to the judge, I think, okay, in the book he doesn't talk to the judge after a conversation with his father, where the father says, you can't, behind someone's back, unveil this person's secret. You can only, and you have to talk to the person. And that he didn't talk to Hannah, he was just, he couldn't. It was just too much, too difficult, too hard. He didn't know what his feelings were, and yeah, he just couldn't. Yeah.
How was the film received in Germany?
Oh, very well. Very well. It was widely seen and well received.
You mentioned that you felt that in the transformation out of the first person, that the story lost or became more of Hannah's and less of Michael's. And I agree, and I also felt that because of this, Hannah became a much more sympathetic character than she was in the books. I wonder if you would agree with that, and if so, whether you think that changes the sort of like tone or theme of the story in general.
A more sympathetic person in the movie than in the book? No, I can't say that. I think what she did and that she was guilty was as clear in the movie as it was in the book. And I think it was also very clear that even in the trial, she didn't really grasp what she had done. I was responsible. I mean, this idea I had to kill because I was responsible. No, I mean, in a way, I like all the characters I write about. So, in a way, I like Hannah Schmidt's too. And I don't know what it is, maybe it's a kind of Stockholm syndrome. You can't be so close to someone, and you are immensely close to the person you write about without liking or loving the person. No, I don't think that she was more sympathetic, but that's for you to judge.
We have time for one more question.
Your book was rather, apparently, it was breaking when it was released, but because it had not been much book at the same time. Do you think that the reunification changed the way that Germany perceived its past and dealt with it?
The Germans, you mean?
Yeah, of course.
I don't really, I can't say that. I can't say that. I sometimes have heard that it was maybe the first book who had this second generation perspective. And when I wrote it, I never expected that it would interest anyone outside of Germany, because I thought this is such a German problem. But obviously, the problem, what it means to love someone who is deeply and profoundly guilty, and how it, in some strange way, entangles you into this person's guilt, and confronts you with the dilemma of condemning and understanding. And of course, you love a person, somehow you want to understand him, and you feel understanding means not condemning as the person should be condemned. So much of what was, as I thought, a second generation issue obviously has a more general meaning. And I think this is one of the reasons why the book was read abroad, and also for many, I think it was interesting to read how the second generation dealt with what happened during the war.
Thank you very much. Look at the books outside, and perhaps you could say hello to our guests. Also, I want to remind you of the lecture tomorrow in the law school at 5 o'clock, and then also the public reading in Coleman Morris at 12 o'clock on Monday, where there will be free food for those, Friday, yeah. Free food for those who come early. Thank you.